A young nurse stopped to save 5 strangers' lives after a highway pileup. Days later, that same act of kindness nearly cost her the career she'd spent 7 years building. When she finally stood in front of Judge Judy, nobody in that courtroom expected to walk out changed, but they did. If you're the kind of person who believes everyday people can be heroes, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe. More stories like this are coming. Sarah Johnson grew up in a modest house on the edge of Providence, the daughter of a factory worker and a school cafeteria cook. Her parents never had much, but they taught her one thing above everything else. When someone needs help, you help them. No questions asked. She used to say her decision to become a nurse wasn't really a decision at all. It was just the natural result of watching her mother patch up neighborhood kids on the porch, or her father pulling over on the highway to help stranded drivers more times than she could count. We don't pass people by, he used to tell her, not when we can do something. Her childhood bedroom, well into her teenage years, still had a shoebox under the bed full of gauze, tape, and half-used tubes of antiseptic ointment supplies she'd started collecting at 11 after watching a medical drama and deciding, with total conviction, that she was going to be the kind of person who knew what to do when things went wrong. She patched up skinned knees for half the block, bandaged a neighbor's dog with a beach towel at age 7, and once talked a panicking babysitter through the Heimlich maneuver over the phone after looking up the steps in a library book the week before, just in case. Her guidance counselor used to joke that Sarah had picked her career before she'd even picked her favorite color. Nursing school wasn't easy for her. She worked 2 jobs to help cover tuition her parents couldn't fully manage, slept in on-campus study lounges more nights than she could count, and nearly withdrew during her 2nd year after a brutal round of exams left her questioning whether she was cut out for it at all. It was a professor named Dr. Alvarez who talked her out of quitting, telling her flatly, "The nurses who doubt themselves this much are usually the ones who end up caring the most." Sarah kept that sentence taped inside her locker for the rest of her career. That lesson carried her through nursing school and into 7 exhausting years in the emergency department at Street Mary Hospital, years that had cost her more sleep, more birthdays, and more of her own health than she liked to admit, but that she never once regretted. Not until the week everything nearly fell apart over a single parking ticket. Those 7 years hadn't been easy ones. Her first year on the floor, she'd nearly quit after losing a patient during her 3rd week, a teenager who came in after a car accident and didn't make it despite everything the team threw at the case. She'd cried in the supply closet for 20 minutes, certain she wasn't built for this kind of work, before a senior nurse named Carol found her, sat down on an overturned bucket beside her, and said simply, "The day this stops hurting is the day you should worry." Sarah never forgot that. She kept a small note card with Carol's words in her locker for years afterward, right next to the sentence from Dr. Alvarez, a 2-line reminder of why she'd stayed. That week alone had already been brutal before Saturday even arrived. She'd covered a co-worker's shift on top of her own, sat through a mass casualty drill that turned into a real emergency mid-exercise, and spent her 1 day off sitting anxiously in a waiting room while her own mother underwent a medical test that thankfully came back clear. By Friday night, she was running on fumes. She'd also, almost as an afterthought, agreed to pick up a 4th shift that week to cover for a nurse whose daughter had come down with the flu, a decision her friend Lisa had outright called reckless, and one Sarah brushed off with her usual answer: "Somebody has to." It happened on a Saturday in late April. Sarah had just finished what should have been a 12-hour shift. It turned into 14. 2 cardiac arrests, an early delivery, a trauma case. By the time she clocked out, all she wanted was her bed. She pulled out of the parking garage half asleep, radio low, eyes heavy. She never made it home. Waterfront Drive, was backed up for half a mile by the time she reached it. At first, she assumed it was ordinary Saturday traffic, until she saw the flashing hazards, smoke curling off a crumpled hood, and a woman on the shoulder screaming for someone, anyone, to help. 5 cars twisted together in a chain reaction that must have just happened because there wasn't a single siren in earshot yet. Sarah didn't remember deciding to pull over. She remembered her hands turning the wheel toward the only open space in sight, a handicapped spot near a boarded-up shop, before her mind had even caught up. She grabbed the small first aid kit she'd kept behind her seat since nursing school and ran. The first car held Michael and Jennifer Torres. Michael was slumped over the wheel, unconscious, blood running from a gash above his temple. Jennifer, 8 months pregnant, was pinned against her seatbelt, sobbing, one hand pressed to her belly. "I'm a nurse," Sarah told her immediately. "Breathe with me in through your nose. Slow, now out." She talked Jennifer through the early signs of shock-induced labor while reaching across to check Michael's pulse and pack his wound. The second car held Ruth and George Wilson, married 52 years. Ruth was gray-faced, sweating, chest pain radiating down her arm, every sign of a heart attack playing out in real time. George was frantic, fumbling with her seatbelt. "Let me help her," Sarah said gently, easing him aside. She got Ruth onto the grass, had her chew an aspirin, and stayed until her breathing steadied. The third car held David Collins, mid-20s, frozen behind the wheel, eyes wide and unseeing textbook shock. Sarah didn't rush him. She crouched at eye level, spoke slowly, told him her name, told him he was safe. It took nearly 3 minutes before he let her guide him out. The fourth car held Maria Gonzalez and her 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, whose arm was bent wrong and who wouldn't stop crying. Sarah splinted the arm as best she could and told her a made-up story about a brave little bird just to keep her mind off the pain. The fifth car was the worst. Richard Williams, 42, was trapped behind a folded steering column, breathing labored, color wrong, signs of internal bleeding Sarah recognized instantly. She couldn't reach him fully, so she leaned as far through the shattered window as she could. "Richard, my name's Sarah. I'm a nurse. Help is coming. Stay with me." He barely managed to answer. It was enough to know he hadn't slipped away. A bystander named Tom Kessler, a retired mechanic who'd been driving home from a fishing trip, pulled his truck across 2 lanes to block oncoming traffic the moment he saw what was happening. Then spent the next several minutes running back and forth, fetching whatever Sarah asked for, a blanket from his own cab, a bottle of water, his phone flashlight, when the daylight started to fade behind the smoke. He never gave his name to any of the news crews that showed up later. And Sarah wouldn't learn it herself until months afterward, when he finally introduced himself at one of the reunion picnics almost sheepishly, saying he hadn't wanted to make the story about himself. By the time the first ambulance arrived, nearly 10 minutes had passed. Sarah spent the next 35 briefing every paramedic on scene, vitals, injuries, what she'd done, what still needed attention, and didn't stop moving until Richard's ambulance doors closed. Only then did she notice how badly her hands were shaking. One of the responding paramedics, a young trainee on his 2nd week in the field, later told his supervisor that watching Sarah work the scene taught him more in 35 minutes than his entire academy course had. He remembered her handoffs being so clean and specific, exact vitals, exact timestamps, exact concerns for each patient, that the receiving hospital teams barely had to ask a follow-up question. It became something of a small, informal case study passed around at his department's next training session, though none of the instructors at the time knew the nurse's name. She walked back to her car in a daze, adrenaline fading into the bone-deep exhaustion of a 14-hour shift stacked on 45 more minutes of triage. That's when she saw the small yellow slip tucked under her wiper. She sat there a long moment, too tired to even feel angry. Her hands still smelled of antiseptic. 2 days later, a coworker mentioned that someone had filmed the whole thing. Footage of her helping the crash victims had already gone viral. It wasn't until she pulled up her own file to contest the ticket that she realized how close this put her to a line she hadn't even known she was walking. Providence Municipal Court, Tuesday, 10:15 a.m. Judge Judy called case 58721, Sarah Johnson, handicap parking violation. A murmur moved through the gallery. Several people recognized her instantly from the video. "Guilty, Your Honor," Sarah said, "but I'd like to explain." She told the whole story. The 14-hour shift, the 5 crushed cars, the family she calmed, the woman she pulled through a heart attack, the man she coaxed from shock, the child she distracted with a story, the man she kept conscious through broken glass. The courtroom listened in silence. She produced 2 letters, one from Chief Paramedic Robert Torres confirming she'd likely saved at least 2 lives, and a handwritten note from Richard Williams himself, thanking her personally. Then Lisa Martinez, Sarah's co-worker and closest friend, stood. She's too modest to say this herself, Your Honor. During COVID, she worked every shift without proper protective gear and stayed away from her own family for months so she wouldn't risk bringing anything home. She's a hero every day, not just this one. Quick reminder, subscribing takes 5 seconds and means you won't miss the next one of these. Judge Judy asked why Sarah had bothered contesting a $100 fine. That's when it came out. Street Mary Hospital had a 3-strike policy, 3 traffic citations, and an employee could be fired. This was Sarah's third, the first, from speeding to deliver emergency blood for a dying patient. The second from rolling a stop sign at 4 a.m. after a night shift on an empty street with no one else around. 7 years of spotless work and 1 ticket from losing it all. "I didn't even realize how close I was," Sarah admitted. "I paid the first 2 without thinking twice. It wasn't until I got home from this accident that I pulled my file and did the math." Judge Judy asked her to walk through both earlier citations in detail. Sarah explained that the first had come 3 years earlier, when a young patient needed an urgent blood transfusion and the courier couldn't get to the blood bank fast enough. She'd volunteered to drive herself, going 15 over on an empty road late at night, and an officer had clocked her about a mile from the hospital. The second had come the following year after another exhausting night shift when she'd slowed to a near stop instead of fully stopping at a deserted intersection at 4 in the morning. Both times, she said, she'd simply paid the fine and moved on, never imagining they'd add up to anything more than an inconvenience. 7 years, 2 citations, both tied to emergencies, and no disciplinary record otherwise, the judge said, almost to herself, flipping back through the file. And this would make 3. "Yes, Your Honor, if I lose this job, it isn't just the paycheck, it's everything. Nursing isn't something I do, it's who I am." The judge asked to see the written policy itself, and Sarah produced a photocopied page from the employee handbook. Section 8.3, no exceptions. Carved out for emergencies, no room for context, just a hard cutoff at 3. Judge Judy read it twice, frowning slightly, then glanced toward the young assistant city attorney seated at the prosecution's table, who by now looked thoroughly unprepared for how the morning had unfolded. "Does the city have any objection to dismissal, given everything presented here?" she asked. He hesitated, shuffled his notes, and shook his head. "No, Your Honor, none at all." Then the courtroom doors opened, unannounced. Michael Torres stood, bandaged, his pregnant wife beside him, and described how Sarah had saved them both. Their son, born the very next day, carried her name as his middle name. Ruth and George Wilson arrived next, Ruth in a wheelchair, insisting she was alive only because of that young nurse. Then Richard Williams, walking with a cane, his 3 children trailing him. His 12-year-old son stepped forward unprompted. "She saved my dad. She's a hero." His little sister tugged Sarah's sleeve and asked if she was a superhero since she didn't have a cape, and for a moment the whole courtroom laughed through its tears. Even David Collins, who hadn't known about the hearing, happened to be passing the courthouse and slipped into the gallery once he saw Sarah's name on the docket. "I still have nightmares about that day," he said quietly, "but in every one of them she's there, calm, talking me through it. I wanted her to know that." Judge Judy reviewed the file one last time. "Miss Johnson, this case is dismissed. The citation is void. And thank you for the lives you saved and for what you clearly do every single day." She didn't stop there. She promised a personal letter to Street Mary's leadership, urging them to reconsider the policy, and called the hospital's HR director, Miss Henderson, forward from the gallery. "After what I've seen today," Henderson said, visibly moved, "I intend to push for that change myself. If this story's hitting you the way it's hitting us, this is your sign to hit subscribe." 2 days later, the mayor awarded Sarah the city's Medal of Heroism in a ceremony attended by everyone she'd helped the Torres family with baby Jason. The Wilsons, Richard Williams and his kids, Maria and Sophia Gonzalez, David Collins. Each of them took a turn describing in their own words what her presence at the scene had meant to them. Tom Kessler stood near the back of the crowd that day too, clapping along with everyone else, still not saying a word about the part he'd played. "Because of people like you," the mayor said, as he pinned the medal to her uniform, "this city is safer, kinder, and more compassionate than it would otherwise be. You didn't just save lives, you gave people back their futures." "I was just doing my job," Sarah said, visibly overwhelmed. "Any nurse, any first responder would have done exactly what I did. I just happened to be the one who was there." Afterward, at a small reception in the lobby of City Hall, Sarah found herself surrounded by strangers, retired nurses from decades earlier, a firefighter who'd once faced something similar, a woman who just wanted to shake her hand and say thank you for proving strangers still looked out for each other. Uncomfortable as ever with the attention, Sarah spent most of the evening redirecting the conversation toward the people who'd actually been in those 5 cars, insisting they were the real story. Lisa, watching from across the room, leaned toward Sarah's mother, who'd flown in for the ceremony, and said, "She's never going to admit how big this is. You're going to have to be proud enough for both of you." Sarah's mother laughed through her own tears. "Oh, I've been proud of that girl since she tried to bandage the neighbor's dog with a beach towel at age 7. This isn't new, it's just louder now." Sarah's father, quieter than her mother by nature, found a moment alone with her near the coat check before the family headed home. He didn't say much, he never had, but he pulled a folded photograph from his wallet, one she'd never seen, himself, decades younger, kneeling beside a stranded driver's open hood on a stretch of highway not far from where the pileup had happened. Someone had snapped it for a local paper back when he was younger than Sarah was now. "Didn't know they'd kept this," he said gruffly, handing it to her. "Figured you should have it more than I should." Sarah kept it in her wallet from that day forward, tucked behind her hospital ID. A week later, Street Mary's board scrapped the 3-strike rule entirely, replacing it with individualized review, and launched the Sarah Johnson Emergency Response Program to support staff who stop to help in emergencies. The hospital agreed to cover future citations issued to staff actively responding to a life-threatening situation, and set up a small rotating committee, department heads, HR staff, and an elected nurse representative to weigh each case on its own merits going forward. The hospital CEO, Dr. Margaret Phillips, admitted the old policy had been written decades earlier to punish reckless drivers and had never once been imagined to punish someone for the opposite reason. "We wrote a rule to stop carelessness," she said, and it very nearly cost us one of our most careful people. That's on us, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." Sarah's story went national under headlines like "The Price of a Good Heart." She did a handful of interviews, always uncomfortable with the attention, always redirecting credit toward her colleagues and the broader nursing profession. Nursing school applications spiked that year, with more than a few incoming students citing her story directly as their reason for applying. One admissions officer at Sarah's own alma mater said she'd never seen a single case study generate so many essay references in a single application cycle. The Rhode Island legislature took notice too. Moved by the specifics of her case, lawmakers introduced and passed the Good Samaritan Extended Protection Act, shielding people from minor citations incurred, while reasonably assisting others in an emergency. One state senator invited Sarah to testify before the committee drafting it, and she admitted afterward that she'd been far more nervous in front of a room of lawmakers than she'd ever been standing before Judge Judy. The bill was carefully worded to avoid opening the door to abuse. It didn't excuse reckless driving, only citations tied to someone actively and reasonably responding to an emergency. Legal scholars later cited it as a model, and several other states went on to pass similar protections of their own. A law professor who studied the bill's language later remarked that its precision was rare for legislation born out of a viral news story, crediting the drafting committee for resisting the urge to write something broader and vaguer just to capture the public mood. The ripple effects kept spreading, and over the following months, nearly everyone Sarah had helped that day found some way to give back. Michael and Jennifer Torres started a foundation in their son's name, the Jason and Sarah Torres Emergency Response Foundation, offering scholarships for first aid and EMT training to young people who couldn't otherwise afford it, along with small emergency grants for bystanders who'd suffered financial consequences from stopping to help someone. Within 2 years, the foundation had quietly covered citations and lost wages for more than 60 ordinary people across the state who'd stopped to help strangers the way Sarah once had. Ruth and George Wilson, after decades of quietly saving rather than spending, donated a significant portion of their savings to renovate and expand Street Mary's emergency department, which was renamed the Sarah Johnson Emergency Medical Center. Ruth attended the ribbon cutting in a wheelchair, beaming, telling anyone who'd listen that she planned to be around a good while longer, thanks to a stranger who knew exactly when to hand her an aspirin. Richard Williams, a software developer once he'd recovered, poured months of unpaid nights and weekends into building an app called Emergency Hero, designed to instantly connect nearby off-duty medical professionals with people in crisis, the same way a bystander might flag down a passing nurse on a highway. Within its first year, it had been downloaded tens of thousands of times, and Richard credited the whole idea to the 45 minutes Sarah spent kneeling beside his crushed car, refusing to let him lose consciousness. Maria Gonzalez's daughter, Sophia, announced to anyone who'd listen that she intended to become a nurse just like Sarah, and started keeping a small notebook of nursing facts she'd learned from library books, determined to be ready by the time she was old enough to apply. David Collins spent the better part of a year in therapy, rebuilding his confidence behind the wheel, then began volunteering on a local crisis hotline, determined to be the calm presence for someone else that Sarah had been for him. Even Tom Kessler, the mechanic who'd never wanted credit, ended up starting a free roadside assistance program for elderly drivers in his neighborhood, half joking that Sarah had made helping people contagious on Waterfront Drive that day. Don't scroll away yet. Now's a good time to subscribe if you haven't already. Sarah organized a small gathering in the hospital garden. Nothing formal, just folding chairs, a few tables, sandwiches someone's cousin had catered. But everyone from that day showed up. Baby Jason had just turned 1, toddling unsteadily across the grass while his parents laughed every time he nearly tipped over. Ruth Wilson, fully recovered from a follow-up heart procedure, sat comfortably in a lawn chair holding court with anyone who wandered near. Richard's 3 children, who now called Sarah simply Auntie, chased each other between the tables. Sophia proudly showed off her growing notebook of nursing facts to anyone patient enough to listen. David arrived a little late, having driven himself the whole way for the first time since the accident, a milestone he mentioned quietly to Sarah, who hugged him tightly when he told her. Chief Paramedic Robert Torres, whose letter had helped tip the scales in court, stopped by in uniform straight from a shift, mentioning that his department now made a habit of writing similar letters whenever a civilian's help made a real difference, something that had never been standard practice before. Even Miss Henderson from HR stopped by with a framed copy of the rewritten handbook page, a note in the margin reading, "Because of you, this page reads differently now. Thank you." Judge Judy came too, quietly watching from the back the way she'd watched from the bench a year earlier. Tom Kessler brought a cooler of drinks and stayed exactly long enough to make sure everyone had one before slipping away early, the same way he'd slipped away from the accident scene a year before. A year ago, none of us expected our lives to cross the way they did, Sarah told the group. That day was hard for all of us. But somehow, something good grew out of it. You changed my life just as much as I changed yours. Mid-speech, her phone rang Dr. Phillips, offering her the head nurse position in the ER. Sarah accepted through happy tears, surrounded by the very people whose lives had collided with hers exactly 1 year before. Sarah never got fully comfortable being called a hero, asked about it for years afterward, in interviews, at community events, by the nursing students who kept reaching out to her. She always gave some version of the same answer, that she hadn't done anything special, that she'd simply done what she was trained to do, and that anyone with even basic first aid knowledge could have done the same if they'd simply stopped instead of driving past. A local news anchor once pushed back on that answer, pointing out that plenty of people had first aid training and still might have kept driving that evening, exhausted as she was, ticket or no ticket. Sarah thought about the question for a long moment. "Maybe," she finally said, "I can't speak for anyone else. All I know is that when I saw those cars, I wasn't thinking about my shift or how tired I was or what it might cost me. I was just thinking about the people inside them. I think most people, if they actually let themselves look at someone who's hurting instead of looking away, end up doing the same thing I did." The hard part isn't knowing what to do. It's making yourself stop long enough to do it. The anchor asked, half joking, whether she'd think twice next time, given everything the first ticket had nearly cost her. Sarah didn't hesitate. "No, I'd pull over again tomorrow. I'd pull over every single time." That was never really the question for me. The question was just whether the rest of the world would make room for that choice, and thankfully, in the end, it did. To the people she'd helped that day, though, she was never just a nurse who happened to be in the right place. She was the reason a little boy would grow up with both his parents. The reason an elderly couple got to celebrate their 53rd anniversary and their 54th and every one after. The reason 3 children still had their father. The reason a scared 8-year-old girl decided to spend her life healing people the way she'd once been healed. The reason a frightened young man eventually found the courage to get back behind the wheel, and later to help other people find their way through crisis too. Years passed, and the annual picnic in the hospital garden became something of a tradition none of them could imagine skipping. By the 5th reunion, Jason Torres was a chatty 5-year-old who liked telling people he was named after the nurse lady. even if he didn't fully grasp why it mattered yet. Ruth Wilson had passed her 57th wedding anniversary in good health, joking that she planned to make it well past 60 just to spite anyone who'd once doubted her. The wing of Street Mary, bearing her family's gift and Sarah's name, had by then treated tens of thousands of patients, and staff had taken to calling it affectionately Sarah's ER. Richard's app, Emergency Hero, had spread to hospital networks well beyond Rhode Island, adopted as a supplementary tool for connecting off-duty medical professionals with nearby emergencies. Sophia Gonzalez, no longer the frightened girl with a splintered arm, had enrolled in nursing school herself, sending Sarah a photo from her first clinical rotation with a note that read simply, "You started this. Thank you." David had become a lead volunteer coordinator at his crisis hotline, telling new recruits during training that the most important thing you can offer someone in crisis isn't expertise, it's simply staying present, the way someone had once stayed present for him. Tom Kessler, well into his 70s by then, still showed up to every picnic with the same cooler, joking that it was the one tradition in his life he refused to retire from. Judge Judy, asked once what she remembered most about the case, said it wasn't the ruling. It was a single image, a young woman standing exhausted at the front of her courtroom, trying to apologize for something she should never have had to apologize for at all. "That's the part I remember," she said, "not the ruling." Her face, right before she realized it was going to be okay. Every spring now, around the anniversary of the accident, the local paper runs a short follow-up piece checking in on the group, a tradition that started almost by accident, when a junior reporter covering the original hearing asked if she could stay in touch just to see how things turn out. Years later, she's still writing it, and it's become the kind of small local tradition people look forward to, the way they might look forward to a favorite segment on the evening news. That same reporter once admitted, in a short aside tucked at the bottom of one of her anniversary columns, that she'd almost skipped covering the original hearing altogether. It had been a slow morning, and a parking ticket dispute hadn't struck her as worth the trip downtown. She'd only gone because another assignment fell through at the last minute. Some of the biggest stories, she wrote, are the ones you almost don't bother showing up for. And somewhere in Providence, in the emergency department that now carries her name, Sarah Johnson is probably still there, a little older. A few gray hairs she jokes about covering up, still keeping a first aid kit behind her seat out of habit. Still the first through the door when a trauma call comes in. Still insisting she didn't do anything particularly special. The people whose lives she changed that day would tell you otherwise. What began as a minor traffic case in a quiet Providence courtroom reshaped hospital policy, inspired state legislation, launched a foundation, funded a hospital wing, and sparked an app used by thousands. But underneath all of it was something much simpler. A tired young nurse who saw people who needed help and chose without hesitation to stop, and an entire community that's still living in the light of that one choice. Don't forget to subscribe for more of these, because there are quiet heroes all around us, and sometimes all they need is someone willing to notice.